Austin, Tokawingawa. I mahi ana o te Ropu Rimu Chief Planning Office. Good morning, hello and welcome. My name is Kyle Balderson and I work in Rimu at the Chief Planning Office at Auckland. It is my pleasure to be your MC for the day it's my pleasure to be the MC for today and including managing my colleagues to speak within 10 minutes, which is going to be tough for them because there is a lot of background information that we've covered in getting to this point. And we do also have colleagues and friends here today from the University of Auckland, the University of Wellington, Victoria, and Deep South Challenge and NIWA. I would like to open today's proceedings with a karakia, if I may. And I would ask, if you don't know the words, I'll say the first line, and you can repeat it. And the English version is on the screen next to there as well, so you can understand what it means. So, manawa mai te Māori nuku. Manawa mai te Māori rangi. Ko te Māori kai au. He Māori tipua. Ka paraku mai te pau. Tau mai te Māori. And together, hau mai, hui e, take e. Thank you very much. Just a couple of housekeeping slides here. The toilets, I believe, are outside and I think downstairs. Does anyone know for sure? I didn't notice them on my way up. It was a bit of a rush. Outside and downstairs. I believe also the emergency procedures are to also head out downstairs and I think assemble out in this area out the front there as well in case that happens. We will be having morning tea apparently at 10:30. That will break up our program a little bit, but that's fixed apparently, so we'll just deal with that when that happens. We do have 3 themes today. We're going to run through them one by one. As I said at the start, each presenter has 10 minutes to get through their presentation, and that will be a struggle. So what I'll ask you to do is please to keep your questions till a joint panel session at the end, and each speaker can kind of respond to them as they see fit as well. And following our conclusion of our program, we will have a closing karakia and the CSO panel, which is covering knowledge to implementation, which is really a so what presentation. And I don't mean that to dismissively, but now that we've heard all of this information and about what some of the impacts may be in Auckland as a result of climate change, so what are we going to do about that? I think that'll be quite interesting, especially as they will be hearing this pretty much today as well. So what I'd like to do is ask Dr. Nancy Goluboski to come up and cover some background for today. Thank you, Nancy.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for coming, especially early in the morning, and it is my pleasure to welcome you for the first viewing of our climate change risk assessment for Auckland, the first one that's been done in 2018. Sorry. Is that better? Okay. Not used to holding the mic. So I'll just quickly give you some background on what the program is overall, and then after that each project will kind of be talked about in more detail. As you all know, the effects of climate change are already being felt as we are already locked into a degree of warming. And we've had a pretty big year for that. Examples of this are the intense heat waves that hit the northern hemisphere pretty hard last summer. There's also regular clear day flooding that inundates coastal communities on the eastern seaboard of the United States quite regularly. And we even have the retreat of our own New Zealand's Franz Josef Glacier, as shown in the bottom right corner. New discoveries from regular monitoring are also made, and the top right corner, that's mine, not yours, the top left corner, it shows the Thwaites Glacier, and we'll get back to that again in the third panel. So as you also are probably aware, Auckland Council has ambitious targets for carbon reduction. It is a C4 city with an aim to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as you know, this week is happening in order to work on the climate action plan that is trying to work on the goals that are being developed. So Auckland does face major impacts from a changing climate over the coming decades, and you are probably also aware that last year NIWA wrote a report on the climate projections for Auckland, so downscaling climate projections to a focus on the Auckland region, that was led by Petra Pierce, who's here in the audience with us today, along with a team of NIWA scientists. And I won't go through all the details of what the projections are. Probably most of you are quite aware of it. Still louder? Okay, there we go. But the thing I want to touch on is that the NIWA, there's two pieces of the structure of the NIWA projections that are important for the climate change risk assessment program. And the first is that there are 4 scenarios, the representative concentration pathways. And we have chosen, there's one that assumes that we can do net zero emissions, so that's kind of the best case scenario. There's 2 middle pathways for if we've managed to do some kind of greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's just business as usual, which is RCP 8.5. And it is that latter one that we adopted for this climate change risk assessment in order to look at how risks will affect Auckland, given the fact that we have not put ourselves on a different emission pathway at this time. The other part of those projections are that they are essentially in 3 time frames. So there's the 2040 period, the 2090, and 2110. And those time periods actually just, those years denote time periods. So really that first time period is really only about a decade away, which in local government speak is about a long-term plan away. And then you've got the second time period, which is mid-century, about 60 years away, and the longest projection we're looking at is for end of century into the turn of the next century. And as you'll see on my slide, it doesn't matter which time period you're looking at, it really does affect all of us, either directly or those people who are in your life. So I just want to say a quick word before I hand over to our the beginning of our reports, and that's on risk. So this is the climate change risk assessment, and risk is a word that we use a lot for a lot of things. It's used in common everyday language, and it does mean a situation involving exposure to danger. It's often used in terms of people being worried about something or consideration of financial loss, and indeed there are people who would consider our humble gathering today to be risky. But that is not what we mean when we use it in terms of the climate change risk assessment. In hazard or climate change research, risk is usually understood as the combination of likelihood and consequence, and vulnerability as a combination of exposure and sensitivity. But if exposure is how do you delineate exposure from likelihood and sensitivity from consequence? And it's looking at those things more that IPCC has developed a new risk framework, and that is also one that we have adopted for the purposes of our risk assessment. And all of it is to say that risk is essentially an umbrella of 3 components, or it's built up from 3 components. The first of which is a hazard, something has to be happening. And then you have to be exposed to it. So if you have a hazard but nothing is exposed, it's really not going to matter much in terms of risk. But the third very important component is vulnerability. So, and that is that notion of how sensitive are you to something that is happening, and what is your adaptive capacity to deal with it. And those 3 things together, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, that do comprise risk. And in our risk assessment, we are considering all those 3 things, but not in total for every subject area. And that's just, we will explain that during the course of the morning, but how the programs come together. So in some cases, a topic area looks at those 3 things all together. In other cases, the topic focuses in particular on one of them, such as just on exposure or just on vulnerability. So the CSO did ask us early last year, or even late in 2017, about whether we could pick up this topic and start looking about how climate change would affect Auckland, and we said yes, but it was a cold start. We didn't have an ongoing program, and so through a very organic process and with a lot of goodwill from the team of people who just volunteered to work on it with already full schedules, what we landed on was essentially developing 8 different reports that you'll hear about today, just up there briefly, but I won't take the time to go through them right now because everyone's going to walk through them on their own. So with that, I will give you back to Kyle and we'll get into it.
Thank you, Nancy. As Nancy said, we do have 3 themes today. We're talking about he tangata, the social risk, which will be our first topic. And if those 3 speakers could please make their way to the front, that'd be great. Oh yeah. You will appreciate that we are going to compress their findings considerably. But if you do have questions that we don't cover in the session today, and remember that we'll ask you to keep your questions till the end, when they will all be here essentially to answer your questions as a panel. We do also have a run sheet at the back, and we also have some bios which have their email addresses if you wanted to contact them directly. And you may also, in the next couple of days, hopefully, all of the council reports will be online on Knowledge Auckland. So if you search for CCRA as a keyword on Knowledge Auckland, you'll find those hopefully in the next couple of days. With that, the theme today is social risk, and we have Dr. Jennifer Joint talking about development of the Heat Vulnerability Index, Dr. Nick Talbot talking about air quality and societal impacts, and Dr. Mario Fernandez talking about an assessment of vulnerability to climate change in Auckland. So I'll ask Dr. Jennifer Joint to come and grab the mic if she can. Thanks.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Jennifer Joint, and I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and Nancy Golbieski. So without further ado, I'll whiz through it, and forgive me reading from my notes. I don't want to miss anything. So the Auckland Climate Change Risk Assessment has adopted the NIWA climate projections under RCP 8.5. And the following, as Nancy mentioned, RCP 8.5 presents a business as usual or a worst case scenario for climate change impacts. The following presentation and accompanying report presents how hot days will change and impact on Aucklanders in the coming century and beyond if global climate change continues unchecked. Measures of extreme heat events or heat waves are relative to the local climate. Recognised heat events are defined as an exceedance of the daily maximum temperatures above the 97.5th percentile for summertime months. For Auckland, hot days are defined as 25 degrees or greater. Currently, we have approximately 20 hot days every year, and by the end of the 21st century, Auckland will experience 4 times as many hot days per year. Some of the devastating impacts of heat waves around the world are listed on the right in the yellow box. It's widely accepted that heat waves are becoming more common and more intense. During heat waves, the most common hospital admission is due to heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Thermoregulatory, physiological and circulatory adjustments are required to cope with extreme heat, and some people are less able to regulate their bodies due to underlying health conditions, their age or the medication they take. Extreme heat can cause dehydration, electrolyte disorders, and as well as acute renal failure and cardiovascular failure, and can exacerbate symptoms of chronic conditions including respiratory, cardiovascular and diabetes disease. Extreme heat can also exacerbate mental health conditions. Currently in Auckland, hot days contribute to a proportion of the 14 heat-related deaths per annum recorded for the over 65 age group. So risk itself, as Nancy mentioned, is the combination of hazard, exposure and vulnerability. Exposure to a hazard does not necessarily create a risk to the population if the population exposed is not sensitive to the hazard. Likewise, if the population has adaptive capacity, they can protect themselves from the hazard. Sensitivity and adaptive capacity constraints have been established through collation of morbidity and mortality data from extreme heat events from around the world, and they include the socially isolated, characterised by persons living alone, limited mobility and access, characterised by households without vehicles, sensitivity to heat due to lack of thermoregulation and prevalence of disease in the population, limited comprehension of the local language, reduced adaptive capacity represented by low-income households, those with limited educational attainment and those with rental burden, housing with poor thermal performance, and the chronically and mentally ill. And local environmental factors also modify outcomes in extreme heat events. Green infrastructure cools the local climate and provides shading, and social infrastructure reduces social isolation, and creates opportunities to take refuge in cool spaces. So the 10 variables used in the HVI, the Heat Vulnerability Index, include the multifactorial indicator New Zealand Indices of Multiple Deprivation, which was developed at the University of Auckland, the 2013 census-based variables, one-person household, rental tenure, residents over 65, children under 5, English language skills, and household rent burden. And Maori and Pacific population data and distribution is used as a proxy for the chronic health conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, respiratory disease, and mental illness, due to a significant overrepresentation of Maori and Pacific people in patient groups with these conditions. Green cover was captured using the land cover from the New Zealand Land Cover Database 2012. And social infrastructures and emission in this work, it's not been captured. The identified vulnerable communities may actually have a significant adaptive capacity and reduced sensitivity due to existing social infrastructure, which is both the physical buildings that enable social interactions and provide functions such as cool spaces, and these include, but not restricted to, community centres, places of worship, marae, libraries and community cafes, as well as the community connections that are fostered within those buildings, such as support for the socially isolated, buddy systems and community support groups. So, data from all 10 of the variables were converted to align with census area units and were inserted into ArcGIS layers on top of the regional base map for Auckland. The data were normalised into 10 ranks using the Jenks natural break function, and the assigned ranks were 1 to 10 to align with the New Zealand indices of multiple deprivation. The use of ranks is common in the development of heat vulnerability maps, and each census area unit is therefore ranked and summed, with 0 reflecting low vulnerability and 100 reflecting high vulnerability across all the variables. Normalising the indicator variables into ranks enables the opportunity to highlight areas with increased concentration of risk indicators. The map on the left illustrates the whole region, with warm colours illustrating greater vulnerability and cooler colours showing less sensitivity or more adaptive capacity in the community. And the map on the right focuses in on the areas with HVI values of above the mean of 52. So green infrastructure was also collated using the New Zealand Land Cover Database. So the loss of green infrastructure is important, as removing green space reduces evapotranspiration, which modifies the urban energy balance, removing heat from the atmosphere. All vegetation enables transpiration, but rougher and more dense vegetation enables more. In addition, tree canopies offer solar shading, modification of wind flow, pollution filtering and reduction of runoff, which all indirectly assist the cooling of the local climate. Tree-dominated green space offer the greatest heat stress relief of all green spaces. And research undertaken in Toronto, Canada, found that heat-related morbidity is reduced by 80% as tree canopy cover increases beyond 5%. So what's notable from this map is that many of the areas that will have limited adaptive capacity due to low income also have less green space. So Auckland Council has committed to the 1 million tree strategy, and other local board initiatives aim to preserve and extend the tree canopy, and this work may be useful to inform the focus of these strategies. So the HVI outputs for the CAOs with the highest total ranks here are overlaid onto the 2040, 2090 and 2110 hot day projections. And as you can see, the majority of at-risk areas are in the local board area of Mangere, Otahuhu, Otara Papatoetoe, Manurewa and Papakura, collectively known as the Southern Initiative. The population of the TSA has high social, economic and health-based risks, as well as some of the highest projections and increased hot days. As you can see, in 2110, there'll be over 90 extra hot days, which equate to a whole season of extra hot days each year. To the east, the local board area of Manakiki Tamaki has high vulnerability to heat and a slightly lower projection of number of hot days than the TSI. And to the west, the Henderson Massey local board area shows high heat vulnerability with slightly lower projections of increased hot days than the eastern areas in 2090, but the same as the east by 2110. So as well as the HVI, we also looked into occupations vulnerable to heat and mapped those. Occupational groups that are vulnerable to extreme heat include labourers, farm workers and outdoor construction workers. The table illustrates the number of workers in at-risk occupations currently, and occupational heat risk will potentially emerge as a growing issue as Auckland is exposed to increasing hot days. Proportionally, 15% of Pacific people and 11% of Maori are employed in high-risk occupations compared to 5% of NZ Europeans. This, combined with other heat-related risks and that disproportionately affect Maori and Pacific people, such as poor health, increase the risk of heat-related impacts for these population groups. Being at risk to the effects of high heat events both at home, as indicated in the HVI, and at work could make Maori and Pacific groups particularly vulnerable. Oops, how do I go back? So what are we going to do about it? So vulnerability to heat is caused by sensitivity, exposure and hazard. Addressing deprivation and health inequalities in Auckland will reduce sensitivity to extreme heat. Identifying and improving access to social infrastructure, community networks and community cool spaces will reduce sensitivity to heat and improve adaptive capacity. Protecting, improving and expanding green infrastructure will help localise cooling and improve adaptive capacity at a community scale. And recognising heat as a hazard and using our existing extensive emergency management and civil defence provision may have the opportunity for further risk reduction. So the next step for this work will be to quantify the extent of social infrastructure across the region and add that to the HVI. The implicit community support may in part mitigate the vulnerability of many of these identified communities. In addition, the HVI will be updated as the 2018 census becomes available and also as new land cover and tree canopy maps emerge. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jennifer. So that was 9 minutes, so that's pretty good. Dr. Nick, if you could please. Yeah, so just a reminder, keep any questions that you have on the go in your head, and we'll have a panel session at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Talbot. I'm Air Quality Scientist at REMU, and today I'm just going to be talking over my report for the CCRA, the Air Quality and Societal Impacts from Predicted Climate Change in Auckland. So basically my report is split into two different sections. The first one will look at the climate change scenarios reported by Petra and her team, and then I'm going to put it in relation to air quality implications. So this is basically expanding on the work that was carried out by Guy Coulson's team, where they touched on it, and I've tried to expand upon what they've given us. I then try and broaden this topic, and I try and look at it in terms of a societal impact and what this might actually mean for a larger community around Auckland. So taking it from climate and community, I modelled it in 4 distinct sectors. The first one is a climate forecast where I broke it down into 4 key scenarios, which are wind speed, temperature, relative humidity, and rainfall patterns. I then looked at national, international research across both, all different sectors of those different meteorological changes to actually find out what air quality impacts there might be if those changes occur. Then, obviously, I have to link this to society. How am I going to do that? First of all, we look at health implications. So what health implications occur when those air quality changes happen? I managed to find some distinctive, both typical air quality ones, such as respiratory and also cardiovascular, but also things like flu and also viruses and pollen, things like this, airborne pathogens as well. And then I look at community level. So I try to actually bring it into a community level to actually describe areas which might be more susceptible to the vulnerability and risk of these different impacts. So let's, some of the results, we'll just touch on it. Temperature, so they predict significant warming, increased solar radiation and decreasing night frosts. And obviously this touches on a lot that Jennifer's just talked about. We'll talk about obviously decreased need for home heating, for instance, at warmer nights, which will mean that there's less emission from home heating sources perhaps. We can have increased ozone formation from photochemical reactions with increased solar radiation. Longer growing season for plants, so increased pollen in the atmosphere might be a problem for everyone. And obviously, as I was saying, Jennifer touched on, the susceptibility to extreme heat stress increases the chances of her respiratory and cardiovascular issues. As far as rainfall is concerned, number of dry days set to increase, but extreme rainfall patterns are likely to occur more. So obviously a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, and therefore we can increase the rainfall in certain times. However, there is a potential for evapotranspiration deficit to increase, so there'll be longer, drier spells. These impacts, obviously changes in rainfall. Rainfall is one of the key mechanisms which you remove particulate and gases out of the atmospheres. So if we have less rainfall, the chances of there being a larger buildup of pollutants in the atmosphere could increase. Larger periods without rain obviously can cause drought. When plants dry out, they actually increase more VOCs into the atmosphere, and this can have a knock-on effect for ozone concentrations and ergo NO2 concentrations for us. And obviously humidity, right, this was a bit more complicated because relative humidity was set to decrease, but the actual water content of the atmosphere would increase over time. So, and there was an increase in autumn RH as well, which was recorded. Longer hot days with more humidity will impact indoor air quality, increase mold. So obviously the adaptive capacity of people to actually mitigate against this would be very important. It has various different impacts on particle size, content, distribution within the atmosphere. These are quite complex processes which I go into in the report in more detail. And also the chances of viruses spreading in humid environments actually increases, so that's a very important concept to occur. Finally, wind speed and direction. Wind speed is forecast to decrease over time. More anticyclonic conditions coming in from the north, so we may lose our trade southwesterly winds over a long period of time. But stronger cyclones again, which may occur. And the health and the air quality impacts regarding these low wind speeds obviously will allow pollution concentrations to build over a period of time again, because there'll be less dispersion of the pollutants from certain areas. Obviously certain areas which will actually be more impacted by these. Decrease in wind speeds obviously can reduce advection north and also out of a certain area, which will allow build-up again of pollutants to occur with this. However, predicted windier conditions during winter, which was one of the predictions that came through, would again would increase nighttime temperatures during winter time, which would decrease the need for home heating. And importantly, actually, for our standards, we could actually reduce the sea salt concentration from our atmosphere with a low wind speed. If we lose our prevailing southwesterly winds, we lower our salt content from the Southern Ocean, and therefore our PM10 concentrations might actually be reduced according to this process. So then I moved on to the social impacts. This was kind of a novel piece of work which we tried out. Climate-enhanced air pollution impacts certain communities more than others, and we know this. We actually identified certain social and landscape issues to do with these kind of air quality issues. And we looked at current knowledge across international research to try and identify these factors. We got age, very important, ethnicity, those were pre-existing health problems, local and geographic features, and urban development factors. These were the 5 key aspects that we took into consideration. So we offered a starting point. The aim of this particular section within the report was to try and offer a starting point for stakeholders to identify social and geographic factors where monitoring, mitigation and support networks could be prioritised. We create a pathway for future research to focus on location-based research to identify communities with disproportionate numbers of those at risk. So this is quickly how we'd go about this process. So we identify a climate forecast. Let's take rainy days, for example. We then look at an air quality impact to do with less rain. So less wet deposition from the atmosphere increases the concentration over time. Possible health implications, obviously respiratory illness from acute effects, and cardiovascular problems could also increase due to those higher air pollution levels. So community risk, so the old are more likely to have chronic impacts from these different health impacts, and the young have more acute and more susceptible to these problems. And finally, location. So whereabouts were these people and these communities situated? Now this was an issue as we're using sort of slightly old data and we're looking at very precise people. Mario will go on to this into more detail, and obviously Jennifer also touched on community level as well. We have some ideas, but we're waiting for new information to come through and a newer census before we start identifying types of communities within the system. but evidence provided may enable development of mitigation, sensitivity, exposure and adaptive capacity at local, regional and governance level. That's what we're trying to achieve with this report. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Talbot. Dr. Mario, if you may, please.
Good day, my name is Mario Fernandez. I'm an economist at RIMU. Today I will present an assessment of vulnerability to climate change in Auckland. This might be one of the most controversial pieces you may find today because, I'm sorry, too bright. There's not a uniform definition of vulnerability, of social vulnerability, adaptive capacity, and so I will just stick to conventional definitions. That is, vulnerability is just the degree to which systems are susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse impacts of climate change. And it has three components that I will detail later. The assessments that we have done at RIMU, this is for improving the understanding of vulnerability, their drivers, the spatial dispersion, also to inform the allocation of priorities for funding and intervention for policy making. That is, budgets are limited, so you will have to be quite efficient on which population groups you are going to target to improve their vulnerability positions. And how are we going to carry out these comparisons between geographic units? That is the level of analysis that you are interested. So, the purpose of this whole thing is to carry out such an assessment here in Auckland. There's already an assessment for all New Zealand, but this one is done in using the coarse resolutions for climate forecasts. So we need something more downscale to Auckland's reality because of the variability that we may have. How are we going to do it? We select a number of socioeconomic, demographic, and climatic indicators to represent exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Those indicators for representing exposure and sensitivity are combined to create an impact index, and the adaptive capacity index just to represent how the communities are going to react and are going to recover when you have adverse climate change impacts. And these two indices are used to identify hotspots, what I call the vulnerability hotspots. Exposure, just the IPCC definitions, is the condition of disadvantage for a system or community, or Auckland in this case, due to the position or location of the subject, object, or system at risk. The sensitivity is the ability to meet a climatic threat and receive an impact due to the occurrence of an adverse weather event, and the adaptive capacity, which it might be also known as a social vulnerability, but here we just stick to the definition, the ability to cope with, absorb, and recover from the effects of an adverse weather event effectively and in a timely manner. Now, how do we select these indicators to represent the three components? We could have 100 indicators, or we could just have these 20, which have been subject to different levels of peer review and scrutiny. I'm not going into much details on why, the justification of their inclusion on each of these components, or the functional relationship with respect to vulnerability. So at this point, I would just say, trust me, we're doing something that is valid, okay? Now, how do we weight, aggregate, and combine these indicators? Okay, we first normalize them in order to bound them between 0 and 1 to have meaningful comparisons. Then we use a geometric product function. That is, we could assume that there's going to be perfect substitutability between indicators. That is, that infrastructure or income levels are going to perfectly compensate or mitigate any climate change impacts, which might not be correct. Or we could go to the other extreme of this spectrum, saying there's no substitution. Income or infrastructure cannot mitigate at all climate change impacts. So we're using a geometric function, which is going to be a solution somewhere in the middle. Ongoing research right now at RIMU, we are trying to do some robustness tests for this function to see how the results are going to change under different assumptions. Anyway, we create two indices, the impact and the adaptive capacity, between 0 and 1, and we're just going to separate by quantiles. I mean, 5 groups, 5 categories, and which are going to be labeled from the very low or low impact to up to the very high, Wow, and guess what? The same for the adaptive capacity. 5 groups from very low to the very high adaptive capacity. We overlap these two indices, and those with high or very high impacts and with low, very low adaptive capacity, those are going to be the hotspots. Okay? Results of all this. We have here all Auckland, including urban and rural areas, because our unit of interest is Auckland as a whole. The local displays to have the comparisons are the area units, similar to what Nick and Jen have done. And because this is the only or the best approximation that we have to suburbs. What we have found here, the hotspots highlighted in black, are mostly located to the south of the isthmus and a few to the west of Auckland. We have 64 vulnerability hotspots, 64 area units, which are around 15% of Auckland area units. So something to consider. Now, what is this for? Just a simple math to let you know, hey, money, interventions, whatever thing you want to do as a policymaker, you should pay close attention to these black areas. Now, we take the scores, we have a scatter plot here, and we divide this into 4 quadrants, into the hotspots in red and the rest of Auckland. And we want to compare what's going on. Remember, I told you there might be some compensation between the indicators. And we might find here in the first place these 5 area units that stand out. Mangere Station, Otara, Point England, Otara North, and Waimonde, that are, let's say, a bit far away from the others, which are telling you those are the most vulnerable among the vulnerability hotspots, and you should pay even closer attention to what's going on there. This assessment is not telling you at a specific level what is the main driver of vulnerability at this point, but it's telling you at least the indication or the direction toward which things are moving. And the type of compensation that is occurring, because we have here adaptive capacity that is similar to the hotspots, but the impact is quite low in Auckland Central, East, and West. At the same time, impact levels that are similar to the hotspots, but adaptive capacity is much, much higher. What we have found in Otahuhu East, Mangere South, and some others. And maybe this is by when you take in a standardized exam, the process of elimination, which are the area units you shouldn't pay much attention, might be those over here. In particular, Newton, Eden Terrace, Grafton West, because they have very adaptive capacity and their impact is quite low in relative terms. Now, we need to construct a characterization of the drivers of vulnerability. This is a high-level description of what is driving vulnerability here in Auckland. We separate 2 groups. One, the hotspots, and the rest of Auckland. And we take means tests and variance tests just to compare what's going on, just to see what's going on. And we just found that the hotspots are characterized by area units with few environmental resources, that is relatively low proportions of cropland, grassland, and forest cover, and associated ecosystem services. These hotspots also have high rates of one-parent households, low average income at household level, high housing stress, that is greater income allocated to rent payments, low shares of housing ownership, and high deprivation index. That is anything that is bundled within this deprivation index. Now let's take a closer look of the spatial patterns. And let's have a comparison here. We have a local board, in this case hibiscus. We are just displaying here the categories for each indices. And we may find here that these are all around high or very high impact levels, but the adaptive capacity is very high across the local board, except on one, Stanmore Bay East. The assessment is telling you where you should pay attention. Now, the next step after this assessment should be, okay, what's going on here? What are the drivers of that vulnerability based on the table that I presented before? Next one, the other side of things, Mangere. Almost all area units in the Mangere local board are hotspots. And these are mainly located in around coastal areas, and there's a couple of them where the impact is relatively low, but they are located inland. So it's telling you something that sea level rise might be playing a significant role here. So what? What is this for? I mean, fancy numbers, nice tables, hopefully, and nice figures, hopefully as well. But we have to acknowledge that planning for climate change is complex. Auckland will face major challenges brought about by coastal inundation, heat stress, precipitation, wind, and humidity changes, which are all indicators that are included in this assessment. In addition, Auckland is the economic hub of New Zealand, and its linkages with all economic sectors require that it takes the lead on developing responses to climate change, which is something that is actually occurring with us today. So the assessments are key elements of policy, because climate change effects vary between area units, vary between communities, within households, between households, even between members of the same households. So it's telling you that we have to get a different level of analysis here. But the advantage of this assessment or similar assessment is that they summarize the complexity of vulnerability, because it has different dimensions, into a single or a few vulnerability indices as I have shown today. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We'll start our panel session now. Has anybody got any questions? We will have to pass the mic down, and I can ask Regan to do that for us, please.
Can I go first?
Yes.
All right. So it's kind of a question for everyone. You've used the current census data, obviously, to understand the lay of the land as it is, which implies an existing distribution of where people are and stuff like that. Could you use the future population projections to understand not the now situation, but how it might play out in the future?
Yes, why not? I mean, it's free data. At least in this assessment that I made, is the rationale is to assess how present socioeconomic conditions and circumstances can cope with the future climatic forecasts. I mean, in what economists usually say, holding other things constant. It would be ideal to include population projections, any other changes in economic variables, but that would require some type of modeling that currently does not exist. But it does not disregard or imply that what we're doing is necessarily wrong. So,
well, from my perspective, I took out from the report a lot of the mapping that was originally in it, simply because what we're actually looking at is very specific groups of society. Say I was looking at the young, so we're looking at areas with a lot of maybe under 14s, which would just pick out areas with several schools, or those with elderly communities, but I'm broadsiding a lot of other people within those areas to highlight. So it's very hard to really pinpoint high-risk communities or higher risk communities by looking at these kind of capacities. So we're going to look at different ways of doing it, but first of all, we're going to have a look and see at the consistency of the latest census compared to the previous one. If the same areas come up again, then I think we're probably looking in the right kind of areas, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah.
Thank you. You had the indicators are a mix of what's important to pay attention to and the things you can do something about. Are you going to try and delineate the difference? For example, green infrastructure versus housing quality. How do you treat the different status of those indicators in terms of what the council can do something about, and then what do you rely on other agencies to take action about?
that's a good one. I could say from a technical perspective that the selection of indicators obeys practicalities such as data availability at area unit levels. So at this point, I don't think I can come up with a clear answer about which indicators would represent green infrastructure, and in such a way that we could get enough statistical variability for all Auckland, because that is something that we encountered during the analysis, that one just a few or a handful of area units containing the mass of the variability and the rest of Auckland having nothing. So yeah, I mean, maybe that is something that we could be discussing this in the later panel about the steps forward, about how to make all these things a real implementation instrument. So that's the best I could say right now. So.
Oh, that's not very funny.
This is working. With heat, obviously, the just recognising that if we go and address some of these social inequality issues, that's actually going to have a massive implication for the outcome for the communities we've highlighted. And I think that's kind of central purpose of Auckland Council. And then the other stuff in terms of the green infrastructure, that's another thing that we're all actively working on. So I've not sort of determined exactly how the relative impacts of each one of those things, but Auckland, you know, we realise that at some point somebody's got to take these things up. And I think all of the things that we've highlighted are actually being addressed through various different policies if you pick into them.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's very much to do with providing local stakeholders, say local governance, with an idea of way they may want to commence monitoring, because we don't know what the future changes will be if we don't have a base level of data. And some of these high-risk areas, we don't have that information. So the aim of this report was to try and give us a starting point of where you might want to put some monitoring in, so we can start to get some base level data, so we can move forward from that.
Also probably a good question to put to the joint panel at the very end, or the political working group, because these issues are essentially political.
Thank you for your presentations. My question is around when you began this process and thought about the framing of these different terms of exposure, adaptive capacity and sensitivity, etc. How was there quite a lot of discussion around how to measure those and the merit of measuring those, and how you landed on that model? And yeah, I'm just interested in how you all that process, because we're doing work in that area, and it is a complex definitional problem. Yeah.
If I understood correctly, how I found the model, how I designed it?
Yeah. How did you find the process? How did you find trying to measure those from your perspective and the use of measuring those?
I would say it was not that hard, because this is not the first assessment that I was making. We were making, actually. We relied on literature reviews, extensive review, and we could see commonalities among the type of indicators that are used to measure these three components. We had to, once we had a preliminary list of the indicators, we realized that the data did not exist at the level that we needed, or it was too old, or which was more interesting is that, for example, agriculture, cropland. Cropland concentration of activities on agriculture might be considered as a deterrent of development in developing countries, because it's mostly directed towards subsistence level. In New Zealand, we have the total opposite situation. So we had to adapt how to define the functional relationship between that particular indicator with respect to vulnerability. Another example, internet coverage, which could be something that improves adaptive capacity. Yes, but if we were in Ecuador, for example, where there are places where you don't even have electricity. But here in New Zealand, in general, between area units, even between urban and rural areas, everyone has a mobile, or it's quite easy to have internet coverage. So that's the sort of things that we found along the way when building this assessment when it comes to selecting indicators. But the main challenge that we found is how to weight those indicators, because some authors, they say, okay, let's just rely on the statistical dispersion or the behavior of the indicators. Let's just gather a panel of experts to decide which indicators are more important than the others, what type of substitution are we going to allow. And an endless discussion. I mean, if we had had that sort of experts meetings, I mean, it would have taken a year or two to finalize the assessment. But we just decided it's going to have an equal weight. 1 divided by 20 is 0.05. And that's it. We don't have any other evidence to justify any other weight vector. Then, how are we going to aggregate it? This is some ongoing research we're doing with Nancy, is that how to do, I mean, what I presented today is just a snapshot, you know, just one picture of how vulnerability may look. But we could derive a distribution of vulnerabilities on the vulnerability positions. So this is a learning by doing experience that is going to generate a lot more things in the future.
With the heat, there's obviously quite well documented mortality and morbidity figures for impacts of heat around the world. So there's a lot of literature. There isn't really much in New Zealand, but I use that basically as and it's data that's gathered from the UK, USA, Canada, Australia. And so it wasn't weighted, because I think we'd need to dig into our own data here to see, you know, what had a greater effect. But essentially for this, that's how I came to the indicators that I chose, just using other case studies from around the world.
Oh, hi. I had a couple of questions, and they're really just trying to get a better understanding of the sort of depth that you've been using. The first one is for the air quality. Were you looking at, or how did you model what we assume will be a changing profile to the emissions from the vehicle fleet as we change the type of fuel we use or move over to electric vehicles? Because a lot of the pollution in Auckland, I believe, is caused by vehicle emissions. And the second one was, you put up a scenario where we're going to get less rain, but when it does come, it's going to be much heavier, I got the impression. And when you get less rain, the ground dries out. When you get heavy rain, then you're going to get quite a lot of fluvial flooding and you know, issues in some of the communities that are subject to that. Did that sort of level of detail get into your modelling, or is this much to you know, smaller spatial scale?
Good questions. Firstly, for the transport emission question, I would say as part of this was concerned, obviously people, the vulnerable groups which I identified, the risk to them was increased closer to the source, so closer to the major roads. So areas where you have a large number of elderly, for example, or children next to major motorways and major roads where there is obviously a larger concentration of PM 2.5 or NO2 in those areas. I use literature from abroad to show in warmer climates of how much, or those climates which are already changing. There's quite a lot of reports out there worldwide which are actually reporting that increases in ozone and photochemical reaction along roadsides is increasing NO2 concentrations and ozone along these areas as well, which will have knock-on effects for those who are more susceptible to respiratory and cardiovascular problems, amongst others. So obviously lower wind speeds as well doesn't distribute the pollutants as we had normally come to expect here. It's one of our saving graces is that we have a very reliable southwesterly wind which tends to blow our main pollutants away. If we lose that, our concentrations will increase, and obviously where I mentioned urban design briefly in my presentation, because obviously we're trying to build up now to intensify areas. Where you actually build up, you lower the dispersal processes of the pollutants, trapping more. When you get more people, there's more susceptibility. So there is a knock-on effect with some of the design. So it is very important, as you say, to start electrifying and removing the main key pollutants, i.e. diesel vehicles, away from our fleet, especially where is the highest population of people. For the second question, the runoff question, did you do it?
We're actually going to do a presentation in the third session on flooding. Yeah, so we'll cover all that there.
Just really a follow-up question to that, and I mean, I think your use of indicators and selection is really useful and provides a benchmark for assessing any future change. Have you had any discussions, I guess, on consistency with a national framework, or ensuring, I guess, compatibility, because what would be good is if it's replicated and consistent.
Yes, there's already a national level assessment, but not using the same variable and the same climatic variables. The purpose of that work was not policy focused. This was mostly on methods to analyze the robustness of the assessments. The next step, that is something that I've been thinking the last couple of weeks, how to harmonize that national level assessment to the local one that we have already developed. So I'm still thinking about how to do it, the statistical instruments that I will have to use it. I might have an answer in the next couple of months. So.
In the first presentation, I think if I saw correctly, you had used one of the more severe or most severe scenarios for your models. Could you just maybe go into a bit more detail as to why that scenario was selected versus other ones?
Basically, we decided that in the absence of evidence to the contrary, that we're on a business as usual trajectory. Obviously, the purpose of today and various other IPCC objectives is to make that not the case. But to galvanise action, I think it's important to have a look at what the worst case scenario is and project that forward.
Any further questions? No, I think we'll call that session to a close. It's very well done. We had 20 minutes of questions there and everyone kept to time, so thank you very much. And hau mau te pakipaki. Thank you. What I'll ask is the speakers for the next theme to come up. So that'll mean we'll start about 10 minutes early. For that, which might mean that we can finish up our session. Grab a seat, mate. We'll finish up the third theme, hopefully, just as morning tea is starting. So we might be able to continue the discussion, which will no doubt occur again over morning tea. So that'll give us a nice break, hopefully. So if Dr. Craig Bishop, Dr. Megan Carbines, Dr. Emily Frost, and Dr. Brendan Dunphy could all join us at the front, please. I can give you a little signal, mate. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I turned it off. Signal me. I'll just take a minute just to load up the slides. Sorry about that. I guess the lesson there is that we can't rely on technology to necessarily save us. And with on that note, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bishop. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, morena everybody. My name's Craig Bishop and I'm presenting the results of the climate change risk assessment for terrestrial species and ecosystems. Most of you are probably aware that climate change is likely to have a range of impacts on terrestrial ecosystems and species. Some of the more common ones of which are up there. There'd be things like direct impacts from storms, erosion, or increased frequency and intensity of storms, bringing erosion, flooding, and coastal inundation. We've also got climate change itself, increasing the level of drought and potentially fires and things like that. And then we've got indirect effects potentially from pathogen outbreaks and those types of things. We considered three major groups in our report. That was indigenous ecosystems, of which about 48 different types have been identified in the Auckland region. We looked at threatened plant species, and Todd Landers, my co-author, did a risk assessment on seabirds. And we also did a more brief consideration of other indigenous birds, reptiles and amphibians, bats, invertebrates. That was very difficult because there's very little data on them. And some work on plant and animal pests. So the overall results, I guess you'd say, unfortunately, I really don't have the answers. I guess the key result is uncertainty. Ecosystems are complex and dynamic entities. Very little research in New Zealand, particularly on the types of on these types of effects, but the research that there suggests that depending on what species or ecosystem you're looking at, what climate change effect, what spatial scale and time scale, you get a whole quite variable results. We don't know where a lot of particularly our rare and unusual plants and animals are, and there's a complete absence of quantitative research about tipping points that might exist for these species and ecosystems. One thing I think we can say though is that interspecific effects are going to be really important, and particularly the relative fitness between exotic and native species, if you like, in respect to climate change. That's likely to be pretty important. Just the idea that many of our ecosystems are already under a lot of stress, so climate change is taking place against this high level of background stress, particularly lowland ecosystems with their reduction in area and fragmentation, and the impacts of weeds and pests and those types of things. So climate change effects which exacerbate these existing stresses are likely to be the ones that are going to be the most important. Some work that the biosecurity team at Council has done has discovered that about 30% of pest animals and 20% of pest plants are likely to become more problematic in terms of their impacts with increasing climate change. And then there's the jokers in the pack. Myrtle rust, which is an important potential factor on some of the critical structural components of Auckland's ecosystems, your Kānaka, Mānuka, Pahutakawa, those types of things. Kauri dieback, which we know is already having impacts, and who knows what's around the corner. So again, climate change impacts which exacerbate the virulence or spread of these pathogens are going to be pretty important. Some data. This is the case study done by my co-author, Todd Landers, looking at 24 seabirds that breed in Auckland, most of which are at risk or threatened, and the top 5, top's probably the wrong way to describe it, the 5 that are likely to be most impacted are there down the left-hand side, and then we've got the risk factors that Todd assessed them against along the top there. We used a similar approach for the indigenous ecosystems across the region, assessing them against 7 different risk factors, most of which was done in a spatial way. The key tool for that was the current ecosystems extent map. It was originally done to determine significant ecological areas in the unitary plan, but it really is the best tool that we have available for this type of work. Much more discrimination than the land cover database, as you can see up there, and we're increasingly using it for a range of different things. It isn't perfect by any means, and but we see this work as sort of the first iteration of things that we would repeat in the future, and this layer is literally improving every 6 months or so. So just running through a couple of the risk factors. The first one we looked at was ecosystems at risk of inundation during a 100-year storm or flood event. So that's actually physically covered in water, not just salt spray and that kind of thing. We used the 2-metre sea level rise scenario. I questioned earlier that could be regarded as extreme, but that's expected to hit 100. That's well within the lifespan of a lot of the trees and shrubs, particularly, that are in coastal ecosystems at the moment. And as discussed earlier, the global political environment looks like we might get there a bit earlier. So at risk we defined as 10% of the regional extent of a threatened ecosystem within this inundation zone, or 30% for unthreatened ecosystems. Other risk factors, coastal environment, purported to be more vulnerable to the effects of climate change from storms and things. So our risk factors here were more than 10% of regional extent lying within 50 metres of the coast, or more than 30% within 500 metres. In terms of the coast, we just used a simple buffer, which again is a simplification. We don't have a sort of coastal influence layer that we can use at the moment, and again that's something else that we'd love to bring in with a new iteration where we develop something better based more on topography rather than a simple buffer, and fetch of storms and those types of things. Where they are, example of that is Lakeshore Turf, which is that top one up there. Ecosystems at their climatic limits in Auckland, so they have nowhere to go effectively, and the example up on the screen there is the cloud forest on the top of Hauturu, Little Barrier Island. Climate change, potentially reduction in rainfall, even cloudiness over that would severely affect that ecosystem. Climate change, ecosystems that climate change had been specifically identified as a risk for, and I was surprised to see that was actually in the literature, only 3 out of the 48 ecosystems specifically identify climate change. And number 7, back to that idea of the synergistic effects of existing stresses are going to be really, really important where climate change increases those. And 35 out of the 48 mapped ecosystems in Auckland are classified as endangered or critically endangered under those IUCN criteria. As well as the risk factors, I can't go into much detail here, but in the report we kind of look beyond then to more subtleties around the distribution of individual ecosystems. The example I've got up here is Raupo reedland or swamp, which is a pretty ubiquitous ecosystem across Auckland and New Zealand generally. About a quarter of the mapped area of this reedland is within the 100-year flood zone, but whoops-a-daisy. When you look more closely at, it's a comedy of errors, isn't it? When you look more closely at the distribution, you find that we actually found that 21 of the 25 largest and best quality examples of this ecosystem type are vulnerable to climate change effects because they're so low-lying and near the coast, basically. So your Raupo, this ecosystem isn't going to disappear from the landscape, but we risk losing the biggest and brightest, so to speak, with climate change effects, and 3 of those are up there. So putting all this together and working on the assumption that more risk factors equals more risk for the ecosystems, here's the sort of the top 9, so to speak. And because coastal risks were a large part of our assessment, there are a lot of coastal ecosystems in there, although there is a montane one there, number 8, and they're running the range of size things. They're mostly smaller ecosystems, but there are 3 there where there's over 1,000 hectares in mangrove forest and its variants in particular, over 10,000 hectares of that type. So, in summary, I'll go back to what I said at the start. Uncertainty is the key message here. We really need some good research and data on the response of individual species and ecosystems to the various climate change effects to inform our adaptive management. Research is required on specific issues, and as well, there's one I put up there, and the long-term data sets. We need to increase our commitment to those and keep collecting them. And the idea as well that we can't wait for that information to come through. We're talking 20 or 30 years in some cases. We can't sit on our hands. We're going to need to act with imperfect information, and then we're in an adaptive management or learning by doing approach. Thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, good morning everyone. I'm Megan Carbines, a marine scientist with REMO as well, and I'm going to give a really brief overview this morning around potential impacts for the marine and freshwater ecosystems of Auckland. And I want to acknowledge my co-author on this, Dr. Melissa Foley, who's now gone to work on restoration in San Francisco Bay, but did lead the vast majority of this work. So just starting with an overview, which I'm sure many of you will have thought of this morning as you came over the harbour bridge or walked in here and looked at the harbour out there. Reminder that Auckland's marine and freshwater ecosystems are really diverse. We've got a really diverse coastline, lots of different habitats and exposure levels, and it creates a diverse habitat for a range of different species. It's also a huge part of our identity and our connection with Tamaki Makaurau, and huge cultural and social values associated with our aquatic ecosystems. And part of that is the ecosystem benefits that we derive from those, such as the flood protection, oxygen production, food and clean water. They also have an economic value in terms of the harvest species and aquaculture and tourism. So I'm just going to give a really high-level overview of some of the changes we expect in marine systems, and I'd make the point that many of these we are seeing now, and the marine heat waves that we saw last summer are a really good example of how we are starting to see some fairly clear changes in the systems. So with marine ecosystems, we're looking at increasing air and water temperatures, which can change both the species distribution and is a source of thermal stress, which Brendan's going to talk about in more detail. We've got decreasing ocean pH or ocean acidification, and that's well known for affecting carbonate species in terms of shell formation, but also survival and reproduction and general health of a range of organisms. And Emily's going to provide some more detailed sort of research on that as well. We also at a large scale see decreasing nutrient concentrations, which has an effect on productivity, but make the point that with the marine assessments in particular, we're working with large scale projections, so at a national rather than regional scale, and we expect quite a lot of variation in what we see regionally. So there will be areas, particularly in the coastal embayments and estuaries, where we get nutrient runoff from land that may not lead to this decrease in nutrient concentrations. So there will be variation, and that links to what Craig's just talked about, the need to understand a lot more around the regional systems. We also get alterations to current and wind patterns, increased storminess, which again can lead to changes in species distributions, productivity and reduced water quality when we get increased inputs from land. And then sea level rise as well, which Craig's touched on in terms of loss of coastal ecosystems, in particular loss of our intertidal habitats and where we get coastal squeeze. So if you think of an intertidal reef platform up against a cliff along the Auckland's east coast there, it hasn't got anywhere to go when that sea level rise comes in. And same with many of our coastal ecosystems. We've modified the land behind, so these systems cannot migrate further inland. Similar effects for our freshwater systems around increasing air and water temperatures, particularly in Auckland with a lot of shallow streams and loss of riparian vegetation or shading. Increased number of dry days and decreased river flows, so a loss of in-stream habitat. But converse to that, increased extreme rainfall events, so when it does rain it comes in a large amount, and that leads to scouring and water quality issues. So Jennifer outlined this morning around the exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity and vulnerability. We took a similar approach in assessing the vulnerability of these ecosystems, but again I'll make the point that we're using national scale predictive changes in climatic variation. And we don't have, like this morning, the census information that we can turn to layer this up with. So we're working with incomplete information on what's out there and where it is, and also what its reactions or response might be. So what we did do was use published expert opinion surveys as well as climate-specific studies for marine and freshwater species and habitats, and compared those to the projections that we do have, and we ranked the vulnerability with high, medium or low, which are consistent with other surveys or expert surveys that have been done internationally. And this table presents the result of that assessment for 7 marine and 2 freshwater habitats in the Auckland region, as well as 2 particularly important species for the marine and for freshwater. So just looking at some particular groups where we have either a high level of importance on them or we have some information that we can use to look at those groups in particular. So in marine ecosystems, intertidal habitats, as I mentioned, both soft and hard bottom are particularly vulnerable, as well as kelp forests and subtidal rocky reefs. Marine shellfish are highly sensitive to both the decreasing pH and the increasing extreme rainfall events and water temperature. In freshwater ecosystems, habitats and species are sensitive to increased extreme rainfall events because they can be scoured or buried from the sediment coming through. And freshwater fish and macroinvertebrates are also particularly sensitive to that increasing temperature. So in summary, As I said, climate change is going to affect species and habitats. It already is within the Auckland region. Even though we're working with national projections and range of information, we know that these species, where we have done the studies, are present in Auckland. And similar to Craig, these changes will occur within systems that are already heavily impacted, and the stresses that are operating already will interact with those climate changes as well. So it's going to be a complex picture in terms of working out what's going to happen. And making the point that ecosystems have a role in mitigating climate change as well, so we need to remember that when we're thinking not just about the ecosystem effect, but what that means for us in terms of the mitigation that they provide. Point again that we're working with large spatial scale models, so more information on regional variation will help us refine our assessments. More information on species responses, understanding climate tipping points and the ability of species to adapt will also help us refine our assessments. And as Craig mentioned, needing to address those current stresses so that we can take away some of that stress that already exists and increase the resilience to those changes coming from climate. Looking for opportunities to restore and enhance natural ecosystems, and as Craig said again, precautionary and adaptive approaches to decision making, because at this stage we've got some information but we don't know how it's going to interact in that complex world. So with that in mind, we've got Emily's going to give some more detail around some of that research, and Brendan after that. So this is the type of research we need to start trying to pull apart some of what's going to happen and improve our assessments.
Awesome. Great, thank you, Megan. Just out of interest, could you put your hand up if you actually know what ocean acidification means? Okay, so that's a good chunk. So when I was at the UN a couple of years ago, and I asked the same question, and nearly no one knew. And it's important that we actually start this conversation, because this is considered to be as bad or even worse by some scientists in terms of the climate change factors. So ocean acidification broadly is suggested as the anthropogenic changes in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, and this coincides with the decrease in pH, because the ocean is very good at buffering this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this is very well shown by the lower curve at the Hawaiian Station. Also, this is also related to the exponential increase in carbon dioxide. So I know there's a lot of other people who have the belief that this is only a natural oscillation, but because of the rate of increase in carbon dioxide, we can no longer deny that this is natural. This is more definitely an anthropogenic system that we have created. And so this is a kind of heat map on the change of sea surface pH since the Industrial Revolution. And you can already see that in this, the lower hemispheres, like past the equator, there's already quite a significant change in pH, nearly up to 0.1 pH units. And that may sound very small, but you must remember that this relates to hydrogen ion concentration and a log scale. So that is actually quite a large change, especially for animals that can't cope with that. And the general trends, as Megan touched on before, the things that we really need to be aware of is calcifying organisms. So these build calcareous skeletons, either in aragonite or calcite, such as our nice little kinna there. And the early life history stages, so a lot of marine animals release embryos and eggs and the larval stages into the seawater environment, and they do not have the tools in the toolbox to physiologically adapt or trying to compensate the change in ocean pH and carbon dioxide. And so this is what a kinna larvae looks like after a few days. So they're very vulnerable. There is chance for pre-adaptation, but I haven't seen any coast around around mainland New Zealand that has the type of oscillation that will create pre-adaptation. And of course, those animals that are metabolically active will have an additional series of mechanisms that can help compensate this change in pH. Oceanification was brought up at a high level because of the California coast oyster collapse that happened several years ago. I don't know if you may remember that. And so when we all learned that that was due to the change in pH, and due to upwelling of very low pH water, that's when this conversation started. And so it's already predicted that it will lose up to 25% of the existing cold water corals, which is something that is very unique and endemic to us, and does have a very large impact on aquaculture. And so if you think in terms of power and green show mussels and snapper, they are calcareous secreting organisms, and snapper have a larval stage. So we really need to be focusing on this. It also creates changes in the population dynamics, and especially in terms of, I'll give an example, as kinna is what's called a keystone species, so it can alter an actual environment. And so when you are changing the population, you change the ecosystem dynamics, and that can cause ecosystem shifts, which is what Megan was talking about earlier. So in terms of my own research, I wanted to evaluate what mechanisms do animals have in New Zealand, and over a long period of time to try and model that the actual mechanisms that they can use over time, not just throwing them in there for half an hour and taking them out and seeing what happens. So they were put in there either over the actual breeding period, so that was over 3 months, or they were put in there from the end of a breeding period all the way to the next breeding period. So we can analyze whether there is a reproductive cost, or they're uptaking, say, eggs instead of releasing them to be fertilized for energy. And so these pictures kind of represent what I've done. I literally use nearly every single organ and part of these urchins for all of my analyses. I won't be able to go through everything today because there's like 25 different things I did. But here's a good example of a little kinna in an aerobic, measuring aerobic metabolism in its little chamber. And this is me analyzing whether the blood of kinna can compensate pH change by using bicarbonate, which is something we would be familiar with, or different proteins, which I won't talk about, but I'm more than happy to talk about later. So in general, we found that really the kinna are not going to fare particularly well. This is because their gonads are going to either shrink or completely reduce, and they have no potential capacity at all to further create, further populate the population. We also need to be aware that their generation time to sexual maturity is very long, and that you're not going to have as many cycles to go through for genetic adaptation to be able to keep up with this change in pH, and so that's quite concerning. You also have the lack of growth, so they don't grow properly in these environments. They depress their metabolism, and this is a extreme metabolic and physiological acclimation mechanism when they're trying to literally survive, and they're in a phase of trying to just literally survive that moment. So, and of course they are unable to biomineralize and keep their chest and spines in complete contact and able to repair them. So this is a really good example of what was happening. So mid is the projected 2,100 projections, and high is 2,250, and up here is the inside of the test. So as you can see, inside the test of an urchin, it has pores. This is related to many different things, but the pores are there for a particular reason. And if you start getting this porous, very, very porous kind of representation of inside the test, you're going to be more easily to be eaten by snapper. There's other things associated with that. And so this has a very significant impact on the oceans. And in terms of the spines are literally dissolving. So this is what we call passive dissolution. And if you go through the different treatments, they are literally dissolving in the water that we have predicted for the predicted atmospheric concentration. So this is something we really need to be aware of. So what are we doing in New Zealand? So Kim Curry is an oceanographer that we may all know, and NIWA, she works out of Otago and has a specific interest in this for a very long time. So she started what's called the Munich Transact in 1998. And so she has already noticed the change and decrease in New Zealand waters with that Transact. In 2006, this is after the oyster collapse, New Zealand scientists decided that we really needed to start measuring biochemical, ecological and biological effects of ocean acidification. And we realized that none of us are actual biologists, chemists, physiologists, economic, ecological scientists all in one person. So we have to collaborate, of course. So we formed what was called the New Zealand Ocean Acidification Community Group. So this is a whole suite of ocean acidification scientists which join this group, and we collaborate very closely on what all of our projects are and what we are doing. So we can also apply for grants together as a group, which is what we've done. And also we are able to achieve things on a much more whole New Zealand scale. So in terms of monitoring, we decided to start doing a whole kind of observing network throughout New Zealand, and this definitely includes Auckland. So Auckland is one of the partners, Auckland Council, I must say, is one of the partners of this ocean acidification network, and these will feed into Karen, which is a project I'll talk to you about in a minute, and Go On. So Go On is the United Nations Observing Network for ocean acidification. So that is very good, and we're doing nice things with this network, but we must continue this with bottle samples as well as using sensors. There's the Munich Transact. So then, as I said before, we applied to MB and we got a nice grant. The grant was specifically for all of the collaborators, which was nearly everyone in all of the institutions across New Zealand, collaborating on this project. And this was to assess pH patterns at critical locations. So we decided that we needed to see what the changes are in areas which are pristine, which is the eastern coast at Karatane, the Nelson Bays, which was what we considered in the middle of impact, and the Firth of Thames, which is an area that we could consider extremely impacted. And so I was in charge of the Firth of Thames monitoring. And we don't have time to go through results, but I'm more than happy to do that for you. And all of that monitoring has now been completed. We also wanted to know what happened to sentinel, what we call sentinel species, the species that are incredibly important to New Zealand. This is power, green shower mussels, and snapper. Also, I put kinner in there as well, just because they're my little animal babies. And trying to assess whether how well they will survive through ocean acidification events. Then add on other stresses like pollution or temperature, and then we'll build up from there. And in the end, the last experiment we did, we all came together and ran a whole ecosystem mesocosm experiment that involved pretty much everything that you would see in a natural pelagic ecosystem, and see how that changed. So we also had a very big emphasis on outreach. So what really is the point if we're doing this, if we can't tell people like you or policymakers or anything like this what's the point of doing it? Like, it's a waste of money for MB or time for us. So we really made an emphasis of trying to push out this information to everyone. And so we actually wrote up a school book that goes up to year 10, so they can include into their curriculum. Is this still there? Oh, okay. I also started up a marine education program with Malays. So the young members of the Malays can come along, and I'll talk to them and run little experiments and things like that, and show them what is actually happening. And of course, then other talks with local communities, such as Greyland 2030 and other organisations like that. And yeah, trying to really hound in that we have warming, we have pollution, we also have ocean acidification, we have this, that, and the other. And as Megan said before, we need to try and limit the amount of stresses that are going into these environments, because ocean acidification, in terms of a carbon dioxide releasing kind of thing, or like the quantity of carbon dioxide, is not something we can really drastically change now and locally along the Auckland coastline. But changing things in terms of pollution, heavy metals, changes in chemistry, you know, the whole shebang, that's something that we can actually do to try and help these animals attempt to survive and adapt to things like ocean acidification, temperature, and the whole climate change suite. So there you go. I'll leave you on this is the Firth of Thames mission of going out, and we actually put them specifically on the mussel farms for the sole purpose of measuring pH in the mussel farms. So yeah, that was great. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Dr. Dunphy.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou e tēnei ata. Ko Brendan Dunphy tōku ingoa, no te whare wānanga o Tamaki Makaurau. Hi there, I'm Brendan Dunphy. I'm from the University of Auckland, and I'm acutely aware that I am all that's standing between you and morning tea. So I will be as quick as I can without being superficial. Just a quick thing about me, obviously from the university, I was raised in Whangaparoa, so that heat map of Stanmore Bay was of quite interest to me. I was like, ooh, yep, that's close. I went to university at Auckland, then stayed there a while and became a lecturer. My lab, we look at ecophysiology. So what we're interested in is what are the mechanisms that invertebrates, so we're looking at mussels, oysters, snails in the intertidal shore, through to seabirds, how do they cope with climate change? What are their defense mechanisms? How will they respond? So with climate change in the intertidal in particular, well, it's going to be bad, potentially, for some species. So some may have to range contract, others will be able to expand, and we're just trying to unpick, it's a bad term to use, but who will be the winners, who will be the losers, and understand a bit more about what's going on here locally. I focused on thermal effects, so temperature, just due to its pervasiveness. So it affects everything, even us endotherms who regulate our own temperature. And so what I like about the intertidal is in this very complex diagram of a seashore, we have a reef and then the water, but over the space of 50 metres or so, 100 metres, you've got two incredibly contrasting habitats. We have the intertidal, which experiences the tides, the subtidal that doesn't. You have two thermal regimes. So you have typically chronic thermal exposures down here, so that's long term, because you don't get sudden ramping of the seawater temperature. Whereas as the tide goes out, for the animals here, they're experiencing air temperature, and in a matter of minutes they're dried out and they've changed almost 15 degrees. And so there's contrasting susceptibilities due to these types of habitats. Ooh, okay. If you wanted to leave, sorry. And what I mean by that is, for the aquaculture industry that are growing subtidally, if they have, like they had last December, a long-term chronic exposure of warm water temperatures, that has massive impacts on the species. And because temperature it is so pervasive, it relates to immune function, it's just stress, predator-prey dynamics, it can all affect those. And so that's why it's really interesting to know about it. Acute temperature exposures here on the intertidal, such as heat waves, that's where they're going to experience that more on the intertidal. An example is in Banks Peninsula during a nor'wester. The temperatures got up to 36 degrees on the reef. Most of the mussels died. So it's real, and it's coming. So why the intertidal? Because pretty much every kid in New Zealand at some point in their life, I hope, gets down to the intertidal, splashes around in a puddle. So most of us can experience this environment. It's a very good teaching environment for us. And so we have a lot of affinity for it. We swim there, we snorkel there, and we also collect kaimoana from there. So a very narrow habitat, but very important culturally. In my lab, what we've been doing is three kind of approaches. We start out by, it was always thought that the ectothermic animals, so this is your snails and all those kinner mussels that can't regulate their body temperature, that they just operated at the same temperature as the air. And so is that true? And so with these $60 data loggers that you can just glue into the rock, we can then get a very accurate record of what the temperatures are on the reef, and then say, well, and you can correlate that to then what the actual animals are experiencing. We then want to know, well, we know about the temperatures, how do the animals perform? This is called a thermal performance curve. All it says is, if that was some heart rate, say, as the temperature goes up, it goes up to a point and then it collapses. What I'm going to talk about is mortality, because it's pretty unequivocal. It's either dead or alive. But take that information, bundle it together, and then you want to know, well, how are these animals going to persist going into the future? Who is going to be these winners and who's going to be these losers? And what are the key things we should be looking at? So first, some better ways to describe the environment. This, I don't know if you've seen these, but this is a $200 infrared camera that you can stick in the bottom of your mobile phone. And so we've taken these and we've just taken some measurements on the reef. They're actually really good during winter to go around and just check your house for insulation. You can see where the heat's coming out. But what we have here is a photo of some oysters on the reef. And we see that this was a 17-degree day that we took the photo. The oysters are actually running at around about 31 degrees on a 17-degree day. So because that air temperature is that, it doesn't mean that the animals are experiencing that. Closer to the rocks, they're actually a lot hotter. So then we've taken these data loggers and we've put them at select places throughout the Auckland region. And the reason for this is, in New Zealand, the tide goes anti-clockwise around the country. So what that means is it'll be mid-tide incoming on the east coast, mid-tide outgoing on the west coast, say. And the reason we were quite interested in this is that here is a temperature trace. This is that Birkin head. So this is one of those loggers that was glued into the reef. It takes a reading every 10 seconds, and we've done it for a number of months. It's just a small snapshot. But immediately, there's a couple of things that leap out. We've overlaid the lunar cycle, and you can see these very predictable temperature spikes. So that's your spring low tide, just after the full moon, just after the new moon. Tide goes out, and the reef, the habitat there, really just has a huge spike in temperature. What also happens on the North Shore, the East Coast, is that the spring low tides occur midday through to the mid-afternoon, the hottest part of the day. On the west coast, it's usually at dawn and dusk. So we were interested in seeing, well, is that true? And do these animals along this northeastern, the North Shore, basically get hotter? And so this is the summation of the data of the 6 sites divided up into east and west coast. And it highlights the argument we have is it better to monitor the average or look at the extremes? And so this is the average temperature data, and you see no difference. So when we look at the average, we're talking about the tide is in, tide is out, and we're summing all that. There's no significant difference among those sites. If you take the top 1% of the readings, the hottest temperatures, generally the the east coast sites are running at about 10 degrees hotter. Their extreme temperatures are 10 degrees hotter. So they're under greater thermal stress during these spring low tide events. So right now, well, not today, but at the moment, this February-March period is really, really stressful for animals on the North Shore because of these spring low tides. Then what you can do is take an ubiquitous, glorious, charismatic animal, such as the cat's eye, and look at and measure its thermotolerance. At which temperature does it die? And its temperature is 45 degrees. So then what you see is on the east coast, these temperatures are starting to nudge up against this 45 degrees. And we saw that we're going to get more and more hot days predicted. So it's not unreasonable to predict that on the North Shore, it's just going to get hotter and hotter and more stressful for this species. This is world first data you're seeing hot off the press, so you're very lucky. It's still under examination. This is a master's student of mine, but essentially it's January 2018 through to December, the whole year up at Lee. And it's just the whole temperature record. We had a data logger go down here, so that's why you've got the gap. What she's also done, Jessica Moffat did some great work here. What she was doing is looking at what's called an oyster borer, just a snail that goes around and bores into oysters and barnacles, and it's quite ubiquitous on our shores, an important component of the ecosystem. This is its thermal range. This is its tolerance range here. I hope you can see that. The sort of pinkish bars. The oysters, this is their thermal stressful ranges where trouble starts to happen. What you're seeing for this species is already the temperatures in red are causing this species trouble. It gets by because it can move, and it gets in amongst the oysters and the barnacles and literally has a canopy over it and shelters out of the heat of the day. If the temperatures keep rising and we lose the oysters and the barnacles, then there's going to be a cascade of effects on the intertidal shore. These guys, and they're not the only ones that do this, that rely on them for shelter, use these for food. They rely on them to lay their little egg capsules in and keep them moist. If you lose these sort of canopy-forming species, then it's going to be a significant shift in the ecosystem around here on Auckland, particularly on the North Shore. Like I say, this is hot off the press, but this is a very simplified attempt at just explaining all these relationships between 3 species. So it's very simple, but it just hammers home that point that if we lose this, then a whole range of other species are in trouble. So just to summarize, although the air temperature may be 22 degrees, that does not mean the animals on the shore are 22 degrees. They are probably 8 to 10 degrees hotter than that, if not more. It looks like the North Shore and those eastern shores are actually potentially going to experience greater trouble from an increase in temperature. So the effects of climate change may be felt more on these eastern shores. Mobile species that can, what they call behaviorally thermoregulate, like get in amongst all the other cover and get out of the heat of the day or even in the cracks, may be less at risk. But if what I'm calling, if those canopy species, such as your oysters, barnacles, etc., mussels, if they get lost, then it's almost like the whole ecosystem is really, really going to struggle. And we're going to predict quite large ecosystem shifts. So my last slide is, this is the Mokahino Islands, and I love going out there. We do some of our seabird work out there. But what I like about it is that we're looking back towards the city and back towards Auckland. And it's a nice chance to get out there and look back to the land and from the eyes of a marine species. Because the ocean is a receiving environment, and as the previous speakers talked about, if we want to solve a lot of the problems of the ocean, we need to do it on land, because that's where most of their problems are coming from. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Dunphy. We will break for morning tea. We won't introduce a stressor of hanger for you, but we do have a short karakia to just bless the food and get started with that. So, as before, if you could repeat after me. When I got it. We will have the joint panel after morning tea. So hold on to your questions, think up some new ones, and try not to ask them over the morning tea break. But our karakia is up there. So, kua horehia nā kai, nā atua I homai, tānei mahuta, haumea tiki, rongo mā tānei, tangaroa, kia ora. Thank you very much, and we'll see you afterwards. Please hold on to your questions until then. Thank you.